Story 16. The Basement Tenant. I'm not the type of person who believes in ghost stories or horror movie cliches. I guess you could call me a skeptic through and through. But there's something about living a strange experience that shatters everything you think you know. This happened about 5 years ago when my girlfriend Emily and I moved into a duplex in a quiet, older neighborhood. We were both in our late 20s just trying to figure life out, and this place seemed like a dream. Cheap rent, big windows, and just enough charm to ignore the creaky floors and peeling wallpaper. Our landlord, Mr. Howard, was a short, fidgety man in his 60s who lived a few houses down and always smelled faintly of mothballs. He told us we'd have the top floor of the duplex, and the basement was just storage space. No one was living down there. For the first couple of weeks, everything was fine. We spent our evenings eating takeout on the floor, unpacking boxes, and talking about what we'd do to fix the place up. But then late one night, around 2 a.m., I heard it. I was half asleep, lying in bed when this faint, shuffling noise made me sit up straight. It wasn't like the creaks and groans old houses make. This sounded deliberate, like someone dragging something heavy across the floor. Emily was out cold, snoring softly beside me, so I tried to shake it off. But as I lay there, straining my ears, I heard it again, this time accompanied by what sounded like a quiet cough. It was so soft that I almost convinced myself I imagined it, but something about it made my skin crawl. The next morning, I mentioned the noise to Emily over breakfast. She laughed it off, saying it was probably just the house settling or maybe a raccoon in the basement. I wanted to believe her, but something didn't sit right. The noises were too human. I decided to check the basement door before heading to work. It was locked tight as expected, with an old rusted keyhole that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. I even pressed my ear against the wood, listening for anything unusual, but all I heard was silence. Maybe I really had imagined it. That night, though, it happened again. This time, Emily heard it too. We were both lying in bed when we heard faint, shuffling footsteps coming from below us, moving across the floor like someone pacing slowly. Emily froze, her hand gripping my arm so tightly it hurt. "That's not a raccoon," she whispered, eyes wide with fear. I didn't know what to say. I just stared at the ceiling, listening as the footsteps stopped abruptly, like whoever, or whatever, was down there knew we were awake. For a long time, we sat in silence, too scared to move or make a sound. The next day, I called Mr. Howard. I tried to sound casual, but my voice probably gave away how unsettled I felt. "Hey, I just wanted to ask, there isn't anyone using the basement for anything, right? We've been hearing noises at night. Like footsteps." There was a pause, long enough that I started wondering if the call had dropped. Finally, Mr. Howard cleared his throat and said, "No one's down there. It's just storage space like I told you. These old houses make noises, son. You'll get used to it." His tone was flat, almost rehearsed, and I couldn't shake the feeling he was holding something back. That night, Emily and I were determined to figure out what was going on. We hadn't heard any noises yet, but it was still early. Around midnight, I grabbed my flashlight, and Emily reluctantly followed as I made my way to the basement door. The old key Mr. Howard had left us didn't even fit the lock, but I had seen enough movies to know you could jimmy it open with a flathead screwdriver. The lock clicked, and I felt a chill run down my spine as I pulled the door open. The air that hit us was thick and damp, carrying a smell like wet cardboard mixed with something stale. I glanced at Emily, whose face was pale but determined, and we began our slow descent down the wooden steps. The basement was even darker than I expected. My flashlight cut through the heavy shadows, but it wasn't much help. The light barely stretched across the room. The concrete floor was cold, and every step we took echoed slightly, like we were intruding on something that didn't want to be disturbed. At first glance, it looked like any other basement. Dusty shelves, a rusty water heater, and old boxes stacked haphazardly in corners. But then I noticed something. In the far right corner, just out of reach of the flashlight beam, there was a small pile of stuff that looked out of place. "What is that?" Emily whispered, gripping my arm. We walked closer, my heart thudding in my chest. The smell got stronger as we approached, and that's when we saw it. There, crumpled in the corner, was an old, dirty sleeping bag. Next to it were 2 empty water bottles, a crumpled bag of chips, and fresh food wrappers. Fresh, as in someone had been here recently. My stomach dropped. I bent down, trying to make sense of it, and I noticed something even stranger. The sleeping bag wasn't covered in dust like the rest of the basement. It looked like someone had been using it. "This can't be right," Emily murmured, her voice trembling. "Mr. Howard said no one comes down here." I shone the flashlight around again, suddenly feeling like we were being watched. Emily tugged on my sleeve, her voice a strained whisper. "Let's go back upstairs." Now, I wanted to agree, but I couldn't stop staring at the corner. That abandoned sleeping bag, the fresh wrappers, it all felt wrong. I started imagining someone lurking just outside the beam of the flashlight, crouched in the darkness, holding their breath. My throat went dry as I swept the light one more time over the far edges of the room. That's when I saw it, a faint trail of dirt leading from the sleeping bag to the wall on the left. There, hidden behind some old boxes, was a narrow door, more like a hatch, partially obscured by the shadows. "What the hell is that?" I said, pointing it out to Emily. Emily shook her head violently. "I don't care. I'm not going near it." But something about that door pulled at me. Against every instinct, I inched closer, moving the boxes aside until the hatch was fully visible. It was small, barely big enough for someone to crawl through, with chipped paint and an old metal latch that looked newer than everything else in the basement. I bent down, holding the flashlight in one hand, and listened. For a moment, there was only silence. But then I heard it, breathing. Slow, steady, and unmistakable, coming from the other side of that door. My entire body went cold. I turned to Emily, my voice barely audible. "Someone's in there." Emily didn't wait for me to explain. She grabbed my arm and practically yanked me toward the stairs. "We're leaving now," she hissed, her voice full of panic. I didn't argue. I felt like my body was moving on autopilot, my mind replaying that sound over and over. The slow, deliberate breathing, like whoever, or whatever, was behind that door didn't care that we knew they were there. We stumbled back up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut and locking it behind us. For a long time we just stood there in the kitchen, listening. The house felt too quiet, like the silence itself was waiting for something to happen. "Call Mr. Howard," Emily said, pacing back and forth. Her face was pale, and she kept glancing nervously at the basement door. I grabbed my phone and dialed, hands shaking. When he finally picked up, I didn't even bother with pleasantries. "Mr. Howard, there's someone living in the basement," I said, my voice louder than I intended. "We found a sleeping bag, food wrappers. There's a door down there, and we heard breathing." The line went silent for so long I thought he'd hung up. Then, in the calmest voice imaginable, Mr. Howard said, "I told you. The basement is just storage. Stay out of it." Before I could respond, he hung up. I stared at the phone, my brain scrambling to make sense of what had just happened. "Did he just hang up on you?" Emily asked, her voice sharp with disbelief. I nodded slowly. "He knows something. I swear to God he knows." That realization made my skin crawl. Mr. Howard's calm, dismissive tone felt almost sinister now, like he wasn't just ignoring us. He was protecting something. Emily grabbed her keys and said, "We're not staying here tonight. I don't care what it costs. Let's go to a hotel." I didn't argue. Neither of us wanted to spend another second in that house with whatever, or whoever, was lurking below us. We packed a bag in record time, our ears straining for any sound from the basement. As I zipped my backpack, I swore I heard faint movement beneath the floor again. Shuffling footsteps, slow and deliberate. My blood turned to ice. I didn't tell Emily though. She was already on edge and I didn't want to make things worse. We left every light in the house on and bolted for the car, locking the front door behind us like it would somehow keep the basement's secrets contained. As I pulled out of the driveway, I glanced back at the house. For just a second, I thought I saw a shadow in the front window. But when I looked again, it was gone. We stayed at a cheap motel that night, but neither of us slept. Emily sat on the edge of the bed scrolling through her phone while I stared at the stained ceiling, my mind replaying the sound of that slow breathing. Around 3 a.m., Emily spoke up. "What if someone's been living there? she whispered, like saying it too loudly would make it real. Like a squatter or something, and Mr. Howard knows but doesn't want to deal with it? It made sense, but something about it felt off. Why hide it? Why act so calm when I told him we'd heard someone? The thought left me unsettled. By morning, we decided we couldn't ignore this anymore. We drove straight to Mr. Howard's house, a squat little place with a chipped white fence. He opened the door wearing the same mothball-smelling sweater he always had, his face expressionless. "We're not staying there until you check the basement," I said, my voice firm. For a second he just stared at me and I saw something flicker across his face, something like anger. "There's nothing down there," he said, voice low. "Stop snooping where you don't belong." That was it. I'd had enough. "Then come with me," I snapped. "If there's nothing to hide, come look at it with us." For a moment I thought he'd refuse. But instead he sighed, grabbed a set of keys and said, "Fine. Let's go." The drive back to the duplex was silent. Mr. Howard sat in the back seat, staring out the window with that same blank expression, but his foot tapped impatiently against the floor. I couldn't shake the feeling that bringing him here was a mistake. When we pulled into the driveway, Emily hesitated before getting out of the car. "We don't have to do this," she muttered, but I shook my head. "We're getting answers." With Mr. Howard trailing behind us, I unlocked the front door and led the way to the basement. The old man's keys jingled in his hand, and for the first time, I noticed his fingers trembling slightly. He wasn't as calm as he wanted us to think. When we reached the basement door, Mr. Howard paused. "You shouldn't have gone down there," he said quietly, his voice flat but tinged with something I couldn't place. "Fear, maybe?" Before I could respond, he unlocked the door and pushed it open. The smell hit us immediately, stale air mixed with something faintly metallic. I shot a glance at Emily, who covered her nose with her sleeve, then flicked on the flashlight. The basement looked just as we'd left it, cold, damp, and empty, except for the corner where the sleeping bag still sat. "See?" Mr. Howard said, his voice louder now, almost defensive. "It's just storage." But as the light swept past the boxes, I noticed something new. The hatch was open. It hadn't been like that before. A narrow crack revealed a yawning darkness beyond, the blackness thick like it was swallowing the light. My heart pounded in my chest. "That wasn't open last time," I whispered. Mr. Howard didn't answer. He just stared at it, his face pale and tight. I stepped closer, aiming the flashlight at the hatch. The dirt trail we'd noticed earlier looked fresher now, like someone had been in and out recently. Emily grabbed my arm, her voice a frantic whisper. "Don't go near it. Just leave it alone." But I couldn't stop myself. Every instinct screamed at me to run, yet my body kept moving forward like I had to see what was on the other side. I knelt by the hatch, shining the beam inside. It wasn't just a crawl space, it was a tunnel barely big enough for someone to wriggle through on their stomach. The walls were packed dirt and there were scuff marks like someone, or something, had been dragging themselves in and out. That's when I saw it. A single dirty handprint smeared on the edge of the hatch, fresh enough to glisten under the light. My breath hitched and I stumbled back. "Someone's down there," I said, my voice shaking. Mr. Howard took a step forward, his expression hard to read, somewhere between anger and resignation. "You've seen enough," he said coldly, reaching for the hatch. "We're closing this up." Before I could protest, Mr. Howard grabbed the hatch and slammed it shut with a dull, echoing thud. "You don't need to worry about this," he muttered, fumbling with a padlock he'd pulled from his pocket. The clinking sound of the lock snapping shut sent a chill through me, as if he were sealing away something alive. "What's down there?" I demanded, my voice louder than I meant. Mr. Howard didn't look at me. "It doesn't matter," he said sharply, his face as pale as chalk. "This isn't your problem anymore." He turned and started up the stairs, leaving Emily and me frozen, staring at that locked hatch. We followed him out of the basement in silence. The moment we stepped back into the daylight, I felt like I could breathe again. Mr. Howard locked the basement door behind us and handed me the key, his hands shaking just enough for me to notice. "You stay out of there," he said, his voice low and hard. "Forget about what you heard. Forget about what you saw. Just live upstairs and mind your business." Without another word, he turned and walked back to his car. Emily and I watched him drive away, the tension still thick around us. "We need to leave," Emily said finally, her voice trembling. And for once, I didn't argue. We didn't spend another night in that house. That same afternoon, we packed everything we could fit into the car and left the rest behind. Emily wouldn't even go back inside. She sat in the front seat, gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles while I grabbed the essentials. I locked the basement door for good measure before leaving, but even as I turned the key, I swear I heard faint movement from below. Something shifting. I didn't stick around to check. As we drove away, I glanced at the house one last time, and in the basement window I thought I saw a shadow. It was just a split second, but it was enough to make my stomach drop. We called Mr. Howard that night to tell him we were breaking the lease. He didn't argue. He didn't ask for money. He just said, "Do what you have to do." I don't know what's down there, if it's a squatter like Emily suggested or something worse. But I don't think Mr. Howard's been honest with anyone about that basement. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear it in my head, the faint, deliberate sound of breathing just on the other side of the door. I try not to think about the hatch or the handprint or where that tunnel led. But every now and then I wonder, is someone still down there? A week passed after we left the duplex, but it didn't feel like we'd really escaped. I kept replaying the details in my mind. The fresh handprint, the strange tunnel, and Mr. Howard's quiet urgency, as though he'd known all along what was hiding in that basement. Emily refused to talk about it. Anytime I brought it up, she'd just shake her head and say, "We're better off not knowing." I tried to let it go, I really did, but the whole thing gnawed at me. One night, curiosity got the best of me, and I started searching online for anything about the duplex or Mr. Howard. It didn't take long to find something off. Buried in old local news archives, I found a story from nearly 20 years ago. A young man had gone missing in that very neighborhood, last seen near our duplex. His friends claimed he'd been squatting in empty basements, sneaking into crawl spaces to sleep at night. The police searched the area but never found him. The article ended with a single line that sent chills down my spine. The landlord declined to comment. I sat there, staring at those words, feeling like the walls of my apartment were closing in. Mr. Howard had been the landlord then too. Whatever was, or is, in that basement, it had been there a long, long time. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. I thought about calling Mr. Howard again, demanding answers, but what would I even say? What's under the house? What are you hiding? I knew I wouldn't get the truth. Some things, I realized, are better left alone. Emily and I stopped talking about the duplex entirely. We moved on with our lives, or tried to. But every now and then, when it's quiet at night, I think about that hatch. I think about the breathing. About how someone, or something, was down there just a few feet below where we slept. A few months later, I drove through that neighborhood again, almost on accident. The duplex looked the same as ever. Old, quiet, and ordinary. But as I slowed down to take one last look, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The basement window was covered with a heavy wooden board, nailed into place. Someone had sealed it shut. I didn't stick around to find out why. I hit the gas and didn't look back. To this day, I don't know what we stumbled upon in that basement, and I hope I never find out. But I'll tell you this. If you ever hear strange noises coming from below, don't go looking for answers. Story 17. The Lone Beach Walker. I don't usually post here, but this happened a couple of years ago, and to this day I can't explain it. I was 28 at the time, recently divorced, and living in a small coastal town where everyone knows everyone, or so I thought. It was one of those sleepy places that only come alive in the summer, but this was early spring, so the beach was practically deserted. Walking along the shore had become part of my routine. It was my escape. That particular morning, I remember waking up before sunrise, unable to sleep, and deciding to clear my head with a walk. The air was crisp and salty, and the sky was turning that soft watercolor pink as the sun began to rise. I felt like I had the world to myself. As I walked, I was lost in thought, my sneakers leaving soft prints in the wet sand. The only sound was the rhythmic lapping of the waves and the occasional cry of a seagull. But after a while I started feeling uneasy. You know that sense when you're being watched even if you can't see anyone? I shook it off at first, convincing myself it was just paranoia from spending too much time alone. I glanced back casually, and that's when I saw him. Far off in the distance, just a dark figure on the edge of the water. He wasn't walking toward the ocean like most people would. He was following my footprints. At first, I told myself it was probably nothing, just another early riser enjoying the quiet like I was. But something about the way he moved didn't sit right with me. He wasn't meandering or pausing to look at the waves like you'd expect. Instead, he was bent forward slightly, deliberate, like he was studying the trail I'd left behind. I stopped walking for a moment, pretending to tie my shoe, and when I glanced back again he'd frozen too, just standing there, still as a statue. A chill ran through me even though the morning was already warming up. I turned forward again and picked up my pace, my heart pounding a little harder now. I wasn't exactly scared yet, just unsettled. The beach stretched for miles in either direction, and there was no one else around. I thought about turning back toward town, but stubbornness or maybe just pride made me keep going. I told myself he'd eventually turn around or veer off into the dunes. But when I looked back a third time, he was closer. Not running or anything, but definitely closer. I stopped in my tracks and turned fully toward him, trying to make it clear that I saw him. I wasn't going to play the part of some clueless victim. But the moment I faced him, he did something so strange it knocked the breath out of me. He crouched down, almost like he was squatting, and started digging at the sand with his hands. Not frantically, but calmly, like he had all the time in the world. The way he moved didn't seem natural. It was too fluid, too methodical. I couldn't see his face. His head was bent low, and the shadows of the morning light made him look almost featureless. I stared for a moment, trying to figure out what the hell he was doing. Maybe he was looking for shells? Or maybe he'd lost something. But why follow my footprints? Why stop the second I turned around? A fresh wave of unease hit me, and I decided I'd had enough. I spun on my heel and started walking back toward town, this time at a brisk pace. I didn't run. I didn't want him to know I was scared, but I could feel the adrenaline flooding through me, buzzing in my ears. Every now and then, I looked over my shoulder. He stayed crouched for a long while, still digging. By the time I reached the familiar curve of the beach where the dunes start to rise, I glanced back one last time, expecting to see him still crouched there. But he wasn't. The spot where he'd been digging was empty, just a dark patch in the pale sand. I scanned the shore in both directions, my pulse pounding in my ears, but there was no sign of him. It was like he'd vanished. For a brief second, I thought maybe I'd imagined the whole thing, that I'd conjured him up in my head, some trick of the light or my sleepless mind. I took a deep breath and tried to calm down. Just as I was about to leave the beach and head up toward the road, I spotted something strange near the edge of the dunes. It was a small mound of disturbed sand, like someone had just buried something there. My first instinct was to ignore it, leave well enough alone, but my curiosity got the better of me. I hesitated, looking around to make sure the man wasn't nearby, and then I walked over. The sand was loose, easy to move aside with my hands. I dug down a little, brushing the grains away until my fingers hit something solid. When I pulled it out, my heart nearly stopped. It was a wallet. My wallet. I froze, staring down at the leather wallet in my trembling hands. It was unmistakably mine, scuffed on the corners and held together with a loose seam I'd meant to fix months ago. But that didn't make any sense. My wallet was at home, tucked safely in my bag. I fumbled it open, my fingers stiff with shock. Inside was my ID, my credit cards, even the crumpled receipt from the gas station where I'd stopped the day before. The exact same contents. My stomach twisted into knots as I tried to come up with some kind of logical explanation. Maybe I dropped it earlier and hadn't noticed? No, that was impossible. I hadn't been to this part of the beach yet. I looked around frantically, the paranoia creeping back in like an icy tide. The beach still appeared empty, but now it felt wrong. Like I wasn't alone, even if I couldn't see anyone. That's when I noticed there were more mounds scattered across the sand, small piles of disturbed earth, just like the one I'd found. 3, 4, 5 of them stretching along the path where I'd walked. My throat went dry. I couldn't stop myself. I had to see what was buried there. I moved to the closest one and scraped the sand away, faster this time, my hands shaking. Beneath it, I found a pair of keys. My keys. I staggered back, nearly dropping the keys. They were mine, down to the chipped red keychain I'd had since college. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Someone had been here before me, collecting my things. Oh, what? My house was locked, my bag untouched. I spun around, scanning the shoreline and dunes, my breathing shallow and ragged. I couldn't see him anywhere, but I felt him. I knew he was still there, watching, waiting. I couldn't stop now. Driven by some twisted mix of terror and compulsion, I went to the next mound and then the next. Each one held something of mine, a crumpled receipt, an old chapstick, even a sock I thought I'd lost in the laundry months ago. It didn't make sense. These were things that belonged to me, but they had no reason to be here. With each discovery, my chest tightened, and the eerie silence of the beach became suffocating. The last mound was the largest, the sand packed down as if whoever had buried it spent extra time there. I hesitated, my hands hovering over the cool grains. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to stop, to turn around and run, but I couldn't. I dug. I dug until my fingers hit something hard and smooth. Wood. A small, weathered box. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely pull it out of the sand. It was heavy, like it contained something important, something final. I sat back on my heels, staring at it. The waves crashed softly in the distance, but they felt miles away, muted somehow, like the entire world was holding its breath. I didn't want to open it. Every instinct told me that whatever was inside would change everything. But I couldn't stop myself. With trembling hands, I pried the box open. Inside was a photograph. Picture of me, from that morning. I was walking along the beach, head down, leaving footprints in the sand. It was taken from behind, and I could see myself, clear as day, in the same clothes I was wearing. My heart nearly stopped. There was no one else around when I'd been walking. No sounds, no shadows, nothing. How could someone have taken this picture? My breath came in short gasps as I dropped the photo back into the box and slammed it shut. I didn't care how or why anymore. I just needed to get out of there. I stood up so fast I nearly fell over, clutching the box as though it might vanish if I let go. The beach no longer felt open and calming. It felt like a trap. The air was thick and heavy, the dunes towering like walls closing in around me. I forced my legs to move, to carry me back toward town, but every step felt like a fight. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see that dark figure again, but there was nothing. Just the empty stretch of sand and those damn mounds scattered behind me like breadcrumbs I wished I'd never followed. When I finally made it to the road, I didn't stop. I ran the entire way home, my lungs burning, tears stinging my eyes. I burst through my front door, locking it behind me before collapsing onto the floor. For hours, I sat there, clutching the box, trying to make sense of it all. I checked my wallet and keys where I'd left them in my bag. Everything was still there, as if untouched. But that didn't explain the identical items on the beach, or the photo. I burned the box later that night, along with everything inside it. I thought maybe destroying it would put an end to whatever had happened, but I still don't walk that beach anymore. And sometimes, when I'm alone, I feel that same sensation, the weight of someone watching. Story 18. The Abandoned Building Dare. I was 17 when this happened, and it still gives me chills to think about it. Back then, I was the kind of kid who tried to act braver than I actually was. always pushing limits just to impress my friends. It was Halloween night, and instead of going to some dumb party like everyone else, my group decided to do something legendary. That's how we ended up in front of the old Thompson factory, a crumbling, half-dead building that had been abandoned for decades. It sat on the edge of town, swallowed by weeds and graffiti, and it had this nasty reputation. Kids said people heard footsteps in there at night. Others claimed to have seen someone, or something, moving behind the broken windows. I never believed the stories. I should have. The dare started out as a joke. Ethan, my loudmouth friend, pointed at the factory and said, "Bet no one here's got the guts to go inside." Nobody wanted to back down. There were 6 of us. Me, Ethan, Jess, Danny, Brooke, and Lucas. Lucas, being the idiot he was, grinned like this was the best idea ever and took the lead. "Let's be quick," I remember saying, trying to sound casual, but my heart was already hammering. The front doors were chained up, so we climbed through a busted window, one by one, into the dark, dusty void. The air smelled like rotten old metal. My shoes crunched on broken glass as I followed the others, trying not to think about how quiet it had gotten outside. Inside, the factory felt like a tomb. The air was heavy, thick with that stale, metallic smell like old blood. Every little sound echoed, a shuffle of feet, a creak of the floorboards, and it made me feel like we weren't alone. The place was huge, cavernous, with rusted machinery half buried in the shadows. Light from our flashlights flickered off the walls, casting weird, jagged shapes that moved if you stared too long. "Come on, let's just take a look and get out," Brooke whispered. She was clutching Jess's arm like her life depended on it. None of us wanted to admit it, but we were already spooked. Lucas, being Lucas, took it as a challenge. He walked further ahead, his flashlight bouncing wildly as he scanned the area. "Hey, check this out," he called out, his voice cracking the silence like a whip. We followed his light to a staircase leading down, one of those grated metal ones that look like it's about to collapse any second. "Nope," Danny muttered immediately, but Lucas ignored him. "Come on, you cowards. It's just a basement." I didn't want to go down there, but the last thing I wanted was to look like I was scared. So, like an idiot, I followed him. The steps groaned under our weight, and with every creak, my gut told me we were making a mistake. The basement was worse. The moment we stepped off the stairs, the temperature dropped like someone had opened a freezer. Our breath fogged in the beams of our flashlights, and the air felt wrong. I don't know how else to describe it. It wasn't just cold, it was like the air itself didn't want us there. The room was massive and low-ceilinged, with pipes running like veins overhead, dripping water onto the grimy concrete floor. The walls were covered in strange, faded markings. Not graffiti though, something older. Symbols I didn't recognize. "What is this crap?" Ethan asked, his voice. When I finally made it to the road, I didn't stop. I ran the entire way home, my lungs burning, tears stinging my eyes. I burst through my front door, locking it behind me before collapsing onto the floor. For hours, I sat there, clutching the box, trying to make sense of it all. I checked my wallet and keys where I'd left them in my bag. Everything was still there, as if untouched. But that didn't explain the identical items on the beach, or the photo. I burned the box later that night, along with everything inside it. I thought maybe destroying it would put an end to whatever had happened, but I still don't walk that beach anymore. And sometimes, when I'm alone, I feel that same sensation, the weight of someone watching. Story 18. The Abandoned Building Dare. I was 17 when this happened, and it still gives me chills to think about it. Back then, I was the kind of kid who tried to act braver than I actually was, always pushing limits just to impress my friends. It was Halloween night, and instead of going to some dumb party like everyone else, my group decided to do something legendary. That's how we ended up in front of the old Thompson factory, a crumbling, half-dead building that had been abandoned for decades. It sat on the edge of town, swallowed by weeds and graffiti, and it had this nasty reputation. Kids said people heard footsteps in there at night. Others claimed to have seen someone, or something, moving behind the broken windows. I never believed the stories. I should have. The dare started out as a joke. Ethan, my loudmouth friend, pointed at the factory and said, "Bet no one here's got the guts to go inside." Nobody wanted to back down. There were 6 of us. Me, Ethan, Jess, Danny, Brooke, and Lucas. Lucas, being the idiot he was, grinned like this was the best idea ever and took the lead. "Let's be quick," I remember saying, trying to sound casual, but my heart was already hammering. The front doors were chained up, so we climbed through a busted window one by one into the dark, dusty void. The air smelled like rotten old metal. My shoes crunched on broken glass as I followed the others, trying not to think about how quiet it had gotten outside. Inside, the factory felt like a tomb. The air was heavy, thick with that stale, metallic smell like old blood. Every little sound echoed, a shuffle of feet, a creak of the floorboards, and it made me feel like we weren't alone. The place was huge, cavernous, with rusted machinery half buried in the shadows. Light from our flashlights flickered off the walls, casting weird, jagged shapes that moved if you stared too long. "Come on, let's just take a look and get out," Brooke whispered. She was clutching Jess's arm like her life depended on it. None of us wanted to admit it, but we were already spooked. Lucas, being Lucas, took it as a challenge. He walked further ahead, his flashlight bouncing wildly as he scanned the area. "Hey, check this out," he called out, his voice cracking the silence like a whip. We followed his light to a staircase leading down, one of those grated metal ones that look like it's about to collapse any second. "Nope," Danny muttered immediately, but Lucas ignored him. "Come on, you cowards. It's just a basement." I didn't want to go down there, but the last thing I wanted was to look like I was scared. So, like an idiot, I followed him. The steps groaned under our weight, and with every creak, my gut told me we were making a mistake. The basement was worse. The moment we stepped off the stairs, the temperature dropped like someone had opened a freezer. Our breath fogged in the beams of our flashlights, and the air felt wrong. I don't know how else to describe it. It wasn't just cold, it was like the air itself didn't want us there. The room was massive and low-ceilinged, with pipes running like veins overhead, dripping water onto the grimy concrete floor. The walls were covered in strange, faded markings. Not graffiti though, something older. Symbols I didn't recognize. "What is this crap?" Ethan asked, his voice. Shaky my voice sounded. Ethan didn't look at me, he just stared at the ground. "I saw it too." That's all he said, and it was enough. We decided to head home after that, splitting off one by one, nobody talking. When I got back to my house, I locked the door behind me and turned every single light on. I sat on the edge of my bed for what felt like hours, staring at the window, half expecting to see a long shadow standing outside. I didn't sleep that night, or for the next few nights, to be honest. I kept hearing that scraping sound in my head like it was burned into my memory. Eventually, I convinced myself that it had to be some trick of the light or maybe an animal that got trapped down there. I knew it didn't add up, but I needed to believe something. Otherwise, I'd have to accept the truth, that we saw something we were never supposed to see. A week later, Lucas stopped coming to school. At first, we thought he was just sick, but then Ethan said he'd gone by Lucas's house and his mom wouldn't let him in. She looked awful, pale and tired, like she hadn't slept in days. I didn't want to know what was going on, but deep down, I had this gut feeling that it was connected to the factory. The rest of us avoided talking about that night, like saying it out loud would somehow bring it back. Then one evening, I got a text from an unknown number. It was a photo. A grainy black and white shot of the factory basement, of that same room, and in the center of the frame the figure was there, standing upright. It looked clearer this time, its limbs jagged and unnatural, its head tilted too far to the side. My chest tightened as I stared at the image, trying to breathe. I don't know how anyone could have taken that photo, but I knew it was real. I deleted the message and blocked the number, but it didn't make a difference. I still think about that night, about what we saw and why it was chained up down there in the first place. Was someone keeping it locked away? Or was it waiting for someone to find it? I don't know, and I don't want to know. We never went back to the factory. Last I heard, Lucas's family moved away and no one's seen him since. I still wake up some nights thinking I hear that scraping sound outside my window, and when I close my eyes, I see that thing slowly standing up in the corner of the room. If you ever hear about the Thompson factory, don't go looking for it. Some things are better left alone. Story 19. The Friendly Neighbor. I moved into the house on Maplewood Lane about a year ago. It was one of those quiet cul-de-sacs you see in movies. A perfect little pocket of suburbia with neatly trimmed lawns, identical mailboxes, and the occasional jogger waving as they passed by. I just finalized a rough divorce and needed a fresh start. The house itself was nothing special, a 2-bedroom with peeling paint and a creaky porch, but the price was right and I figured I could fix it up. My plan was to keep my head down, enjoy the quiet, and stay far away from any nosy neighbors. Of course, life doesn't always go according to plan. The first time I met her, I was unpacking boxes in my driveway. She shuffled over from across the street with the kind of deliberate slowness that comes with age. She wore a faded yellow cardigan, big round glasses that made her eyes look huge, and her white hair was neatly curled like an old-time movie star. She introduced herself as Mrs. Garvey and handed me a Tupperware container filled with chocolate chip cookies. "Welcome to the neighborhood, dear," she said in a warm, cheerful voice. "It's not often we get new faces here. I'm not much of a talker, but she had this disarming energy about her, the kind that made you feel like you'd known her for years. Before I knew it, we were chatting about how long she'd lived in the area, over 40 years apparently, and how nice it was to see someone bringing life back to the street. I remember thinking it was kind of sweet how she cared so much about such a quiet place. The cookies were surprisingly good, soft, chewy, and still slightly warm, as if she'd baked them just minutes before walking over. That night, I sat on my creaky porch with a beer and a plate of them, watching the sun dip below the treetops. The street was eerily silent, the kind of quiet you can't help but notice. A lone street lamp flickered at the end of the cul-de-sac, and I remember catching a glimpse of Mrs. Garvey peeking through her curtains across the street. It struck me as odd, almost like she was checking on me, but I shrugged it off. After all, old folks can be curious, right? The next day, she invited me over for dinner. I hesitated at first. I wasn't in the habit of socializing, but she had a way of making you feel guilty for saying no. "It's just a little dinner," she said, her smile bright and wide. "Besides, I make the best pot roast in town." So that evening, I found myself walking up her perfectly kept porch steps, carrying a cheap bottle of red wine I'd grabbed from the gas station. Her house smelled incredible, rich, savory aromas wafting out as soon as she opened the door. Inside, it was immaculate. Every piece of furniture looked like it had been polished to a shine, and old family photos in golden frames lined the walls. It felt oddly timeless, like stepping into a home that hadn't changed in decades. We ate in her dining room, the kind of formal space no one really uses anymore. The table was set with pristine white china and a lace tablecloth that looked like it had been hand-stitched 100 years ago. The pot roast really was amazing, tender and full of flavor, and Mrs. Garvey chatted the whole time, asking about my job, my family, and my plans for fixing up the house. She was so sharp and lively that I found myself forgetting her age entirely. There was something comforting about her presence, like she could make the whole world feel smaller and more manageable just by talking. After dinner, she insisted on showing me her treasures, as she called them. She led me to the living room, where cabinets and shelves were filled with porcelain figurines, antique clocks, and dusty old books. She told me stories about each one, how she'd picked up a cuckoo clock in Germany when her late husband was stationed there, or how a set of delicate teacups had belonged to her grandmother. I nodded along, even though I couldn't shake a weird feeling creeping up my spine. The room was warm, almost stiflingly so, and the tick-tock of the clock seemed to grow louder with every passing second. I started to feel like I was intruding, like I'd stumbled into some place that had been sealed off for years. I left her house that night feeling oddly drained, like I'd just run a marathon. When I got home, I collapsed onto my couch, my mind buzzing with everything I'd seen and heard. I chalked it up to being tired from the move and the unusual amount of socializing. Still, something gnawed at me, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Mrs. Garvey's stories had been so vivid, so detailed, and yet the air in her house felt heavy, almost like it was filled with dust that you couldn't see. I shook it off and went to bed, but I slept fitfully, tossing and turning until dawn. The next morning, I decided to take a walk around the neighborhood, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. As I passed Mrs. Garvey's house, I stopped and stared. The curtains that she'd peeked through just the other day were still drawn shut, but the house looked different. The porch steps were cracked, the paint was peeling, and weeds were sprouting up through the cracks in the walkway. I frowned. I could have sworn her yard had been immaculate when I'd visited. Maybe I just imagined it? I shook my head and kept walking, trying to brush off the strange feeling in my chest. By the end of the week, I couldn't ignore it anymore. Every time I looked out my window, Mrs. Garvey's house seemed more neglected. Her perfectly kept lawn was now overgrown, the windows smeared with grime, and the front door looked like it hadn't been opened in years. I didn't understand, I'd just been there. She'd made me dinner, for God's sake. I decided to go over and check on her, convincing myself that maybe she was sick or needed help. As I crossed the street, the unease in my chest grew heavier with every step. Something wasn't right. I knocked on her door, the sound echoing unnaturally through the house. No answer. I knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. My gut told me to leave, but curiosity got the better of me. I turned the doorknob, and to my surprise, it swung open with a groan. The air inside was stale, thick with the smell of mildew and something else. Something rotten. The living room was completely different from what I remembered. The furniture was covered in sheets, cobwebs stretched across the walls, and a layer of dust blanketed everything. It looked like no one had lived there for decades. My heart pounded in my chest as I stumbled back outside, gasping for fresh air. I stood on the porch, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. Mrs. Garvey, her cookies, her stories, her perfect pot roast. None of it made any sense. I turned to leave, but something caught my eye. A family photo sitting in the dust-covered window. I stepped closer, squinting through the grime, and felt the blood drain from my face. There she was, standing next to a man I assumed was her husband, but the photo was old, faded, and yellowed with age. And the date written at the bottom? 1972. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at that photo, my mind racing. I haven't seen Mrs. Garvey since that day. Her house still sits empty, just as I found it, a forgotten relic at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. Sometimes I think I see movement behind the curtains, or a flicker of light through the grime-streaked windows. I tell myself it's just my imagination, but I've stopped sitting on my porch at night. Whatever happened, whatever she was, I don't want to know. Story 20. The last bus stop. I was 22 when it happened. Fresh out of college, juggling a boring office job during the day and night classes for a degree I wasn't even sure I wanted. My life back then felt like one big loop: work, school, bus rides, sleep, repeat. I'd take the bus home every evening, always zoning out with my headphones on, too tired to care about the world outside. That night wasn't any different. I was slumped against the window, watching streaks of light blur past, feeling that familiar drowsiness pull me under. I remember thinking, just close your eyes for a second. I didn't even feel myself drifting off. When I woke up, the bus was completely still, the hum of the engine gone. My neck hurt from leaning at an awkward angle, and for a moment I felt disoriented. The lights inside were dim, just enough to cast a cold glow over the empty seats. I sat up quickly, my heart skipping a beat as I realized I was alone. I checked my phone, 2:34 a.m. What the hell? I'd missed my stop, apparently all of them, because this was the last one. I stood up and looked around, expecting to see the driver at the front, but the seat was empty. That's when I noticed something outside the window. Trees? Nothing but trees and darkness stretching beyond. I grabbed my bag and hurried down the aisle toward the door, my footsteps loud in the dead silence. I was calling out, "Hello? Anyone here?" just in case the driver was around, but no one answered. The air felt heavier as I stepped off the bus. The first thing that hit me was the cold. Not a normal nighttime chill, but a sharp, biting cold that sank right into my bones. I looked around, my breath misting in the air. The area wasn't just unfamiliar, it felt wrong. The bus was parked on a narrow, cracked road that seemed to lead nowhere, flanked on both sides by thick trees. There weren't any street lights, no sound of cars, no hum of life. Just stillness and dark shadows stretching into the forest. I turned back to the bus, trying to decide if I should just wait there until morning or start walking in hopes of finding help. That's when I saw him. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. A shape was standing just at the edge of the tree line, barely visible in the moonlight. I squinted and my stomach dropped when I realized it was the driver. He was just standing there, perfectly still, halfway hidden behind a tree. I couldn't see his face clearly, but I could feel his eyes on me. The way he was positioned, like he was watching but didn't want to be seen, made my skin crawl. My mind raced. Why is he out there? Why isn't he on the bus? I froze on the spot, my breath catching in my throat. Everything about the way he stood there felt off. His shoulders were slightly hunched, his head tilted at an unnatural angle, like he was studying me. My instincts screamed at me to move, but my body refused to cooperate. I glanced back at the bus, suddenly unsure if it was safer inside or out here in the cold. When I looked back at the trees, he was gone. My chest tightened and a shiver ran through me, not from the cold this time, but from the sickening unease spreading through my body. Did he go back into the woods? Is he watching me from somewhere else now? Every fiber of my being told me to leave, but I had no idea where to go. I could barely see my hand in front of my face in the dark, let alone a path or road that could lead to help. I pulled out my phone, desperate for something. Maps, calls, even just a flashlight. Nothing. No signal, and the flashlight icon refused to turn on. Great, I muttered, trying to keep my voice steady, even though I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. I turned back toward the bus, deciding that shelter was better than nothing, but I stopped cold. The bus door, which I was sure I had left open, was now closed. I stared at the closed bus door, my mind racing. Had I accidentally triggered it somehow? Or, no, I didn't even want to finish that thought. I felt utterly exposed standing there in the open, the weight of the trees pressing in around me. My hands trembled as I walked up to the bus, hesitating before reaching for the door. I gave it a yank, but it wouldn't budge. Lock. I knocked on the glass, half expecting the driver to appear in the front seat again, but the bus remained dark and empty. Hello? My voice cracked, swallowed by the silence. The only answer was the whisper of the wind moving through the trees, and somewhere far off, the faint snap of a branch breaking. Panic started creeping in. I turned on my heels and stared at the road stretching behind the bus, if you could even call it a road. It was cracked and uneven, disappearing into darkness in both directions. I weighed my options. I could stay here and wait for someone, anyone, to find me, or I could start walking and hope I didn't get lost. I was about to take a step when I heard it, a low, muffled sound coming from the woods. At first, it almost sounded like humming, slow and deliberate. My body went rigid as the sound grew clearer. It was coming closer. My head snapped toward the trees, my eyes darting between the black spaces between the trunks. I couldn't see anyone, but I could feel someone watching me again. I couldn't take it anymore. My feet moved before I had fully decided. I turned and started walking down the road, forcing myself not to look back at the trees. My steps echoed in the silence, every scuff of my shoes sounding too loud. The humming had stopped, but that didn't comfort me. If anything, the sudden quiet felt worse, like the world was holding its breath. I kept glancing at my phone, hoping for a signal, but the screen stayed dead. It felt like I'd been walking for hours, though it was probably only 10 minutes, when I noticed something up ahead. Faint lights cutting through the trees. Relief flooded me as I hurried toward them. The lights had to mean something. Another bus, a house, a car, anything that wasn't this nightmare. But as I got closer, my stomach dropped. It was the bus. The same bus. I stopped dead in my tracks, staring at it. Somehow, impossibly, I'd circled back to where I started. The door was still closed, the interior dark and empty. My legs wobbled as I realized I couldn't even see my own footprints in the dirt road. "This isn't happening," I whispered to myself, my voice shaking. That's when I noticed him again. The driver. He was standing farther back in the trees now, just a shadow with the faintest outline of his uniform, perfectly still, watching. I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened as I stared into the trees, my gaze locked on the shadowy figure. I wanted to scream at him, ask him what he wanted, why he was watching me, but the words wouldn't come out. My mind was a blur of panic and confusion. Slowly, I started backing away from the bus, keeping my eyes on him. The farther I moved, the more the shadows swallowed him up, but I knew he was still there. I could feel his presence like an itch beneath my skin. Just as I was about to turn and run, the sound came back. That low humming. Except this time, it wasn't coming from the woods. It was coming from behind me. I spun around so fast I nearly fell over, my eyes darting to the bus. The sound was coming from inside. The lights flickered on for half a second, casting strange, broken shadows through the windows before plunging back into darkness. My pulse hammered in my ears as I stared at the empty vehicle. It felt like a trap, like something was waiting for me to step closer. I took one shaky step back, then another. A chill ran through me, and for the first time, I realized that whatever was happening wasn't just strange, it wasn't natural. This wasn't a driver playing a sick joke or me being lost. This was something else. I didn't think. I turned and ran, full sprint, down that broken road, the cold air burning my lungs with every breath. The humming followed me, louder now, almost vibrating through my body. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear something moving behind me. Heavy, deliberate steps, like someone, or something, was following at a steady pace. I stumbled once, skinning my hands on the rough gravel, but I scrambled back up and kept running. My mind was screaming at me to keep going, but a small voice in the back of my head whispered that there was no way out. "I'll end up back at the bus again," it said. I shoved that thought down and ran harder. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps stopped, and the humming cut off mid-note. The abrupt silence was so jarring I almost fell again. I slowed to a stop, my heart threatening to burst out of my chest. I was surrounded by nothing but darkness and trees. I turned in a slow circle, trying to make sense of where I was. That's when I saw the light. Real light this time, far in the distance, glowing faintly like a beacon. I ran toward it, tears streaming down my face, desperate for this nightmare to end. As I got closer, I realized it was a small building, an old gas station. I practically collapsed against the door, banging on it with both fists until an older man inside opened up, startled and wide-eyed. The man stared at me like I was crazy as I stumbled inside, gasping for breath. "Are you okay? What happened to you?" he asked, his voice gruff but concerned. I couldn't even get the words out at first. I looked over my shoulder through the grimy windows, expecting to see the bus, the driver, or something waiting in the dark. But there was nothing. Just an empty road stretching into the woods. I finally managed to choke out, "The bus, the driver, he was watching me." The man frowned, clearly confused. "There's no bus stop out here, miss. Never has been." His words hit me like a punch. I turned and stared at him, shaking my head. "No, I saw it. I was on it. It's out there." He didn't argue. Instead, he grabbed an old landline phone and called the local sheriff to come check things out. While we waited, I sat in a chair by the window, my knees pulled up to my chest, flinching at every sound outside. When the sheriff arrived, I told him everything, about falling asleep, the bus stop, the driver, the impossible road that led me back to the bus. He didn't say much, just exchanged a look with the gas station owner. "We'll take a drive out there," he said, almost like he was humoring me. I didn't want to go with them, but I also couldn't stand being alone. So I climbed into the back of the patrol car, my whole body still shaking. The drive back felt like a blur. The sheriff's headlights cut through the dark, but the road looked normal. No cracks, no endless stretches of nothingness, just an ordinary back road surrounded by trees. "Are you sure it was here?" he asked, his tone careful. I nodded frantically, pointing out where I thought the bus had been. But there was nothing there. No bus, no tire marks, no sign that anyone had been there at all. My throat went dry. I swear it was here. I saw him. He was watching me. The sheriff sighed and turned the car around, but I couldn't stop staring out the window. I half expected to see the driver, standing just beyond the trees, his head tilted like before. They dropped me back at the gas station and offered to drive me home, but I couldn't bring myself to get in another vehicle. The gas station owner let me stay until morning, and when the first light broke, I finally called a friend to come pick me up. I never took the bus again after that. I don't even know if I imagined the whole thing or if something really happened out there. But sometimes, when I'm driving alone at night and I see a bus stopped on the side of the road, my stomach turns. I can't help but glance at the tree line, half expecting to see him there, watching.